How about that to start? Well, I'm here once more with my Jesus action figure to bring you the last intro to the Gospel of John, and perhaps we can delve into a couple of the chapters too to see the difference between John and the rest of how the book works, like the specific chapter titles and so forth. We talked about John's dualism and Gnosticism and the reliance on these other Jewish trends, other Jewish, groups. But when we look at the picture that John draws, we can get a sense of just how different John is. We talked that John's Jesus is Superman. And Jesus knows things. He knows things that people don't know. He's able to do things that other people can't do. In John 4, the Samaritan woman joins Jesus at a well. And Jesus, first of all, everything about John's gospel is symbolic. But I haven't figured out exactly how the symbolism works. But Jesus shows up at this well with nothing to draw with or from. Like he's got no bucket and he's got no way. And here comes this lady and she says, "Sir, can you give me a hand and help me to..." So Jesus asks the lady for a hand getting the water. And that turns into this whole diatribe. And, about Samaritan worship, about the placement, and it's Jacob's well, and what do the Samaritans know of worship? In any case, Jesus proceeds to tell her things about how the Spirit will come. Those who worship will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And the woman is amazed. And Jesus says, "Go call your husband." And she looks at Jesus and says, "Sir, I have no husband." And Jesus answers her and says, "You are right to say that you have no husband, for you have had a number of husbands," that I can't remember if the number is 4 or 5, "and the one you're living with is not your husband." And so I love the woman's reply, "Oh, I perceive you are a prophet." Well, indeed, Jesus knows these details of this lady's life, and he's able to, kind of show her about who he is. In John 13, he is aware. I want to look at that passage for a moment. John 13, and let's kind of find our way there. Jesus knows that somebody's going to betray him. And he none of the other people know it. Jesus knows it. He seems to know the whole story. And then he says, "One of you is going to betray me. It's the one that I give this piece of bread that I've dipped in the dish." And so it's Judas. And this comment Jesus makes indicates some kind of supernatural knowledge that Jesus just calmly gives the piece of bread to Judas, and then on he goes. But look what happens just after this. The Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and you will glorify him at once. So the glory of Jesus is his death on the cross. It's the glorification of God that Jesus should do this which Jesus has been called to do. The Word which became flesh and dwelt among the people is the same one, the pre-existent one, who will die in this story. We see that John 11 in the Lazarus episode, Jesus knows that Lazarus isn't going to make it. And he says that this is happening so that in his life, Lazarus can glorify God. But Jesus clearly knows that Lazarus is going to die. And he shows up late, and so late, in fact, that Lazarus has been in the tomb already for 4 days. And then inexplicably, right, Jesus says, "Lazarus, come forth." They roll the stone away. And then Jesus looks at the crowd And I love this. He says, go ahead and unwrap him. And I always think to myself, that's the last place you'd see me, is unwrapping a dead guy. That would be somebody else's duty, you know. The I am sayings of Jesus, as we have said before, echo Exodus 3. It's Exodus 3, and how the name of God is cared for in that spot. It's equivalent to the name of God. John 10 and Ezekiel 34, and we've looked at those parallels too. So Jesus has this special relationship with God, the relationship of a father to a son, the one who's sent to the one who receives the message, and the messenger. I want to draw attention, if I could, for just a moment, to John 6. In John 6, that this is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And look at how the three other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have the parallel story. Luke gives it 14 verses, or Luke gives it 7 verses. Mark gives it 14. Matthew gives it, the 8 verses. So it's a little shorter in those other two. So here he gives the bread and the fish, and there's a big feeding story. Next, Jesus walks on the water. Notice here that this is Matthew and then Luke, or Matthew and Mark. Boy, I'm having a hard time seeing the M in front of that K. And so he says, he comes, they're terrified. It is I, don't be afraid. Then look what happens. The next day, the crowd that stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there'd been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat. So John's gospel is helping you process, wait, Jesus didn't get into that boat, yet he's here. So how did they do that? And so they come looking, and this whole diatribe is really, really interesting. He tells them that they're only here because their bellies were full and is looking for more. And then he echoes in verse 31, our ancestors, and says, truly, truly, I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. That's self-referential. Jesus was talking about himself. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And then he says, they ask, give us this bread. Just like the woman at the well says, give me this water that I can drink. The crowd say, give us this bread. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. And this is one of the more paradoxical sayings. Look, he said, I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So I want to rehearse for you just a bit about the manna. In Exodus, not Exodus, this is going to be Numbers. The Israelites are in trouble, and they're hungry, and they're wandering in the desert. And God says to Moses, have the people go outside, and in the morning they're going to find something on the ground. They're going to pick it up and they're going to eat it. And they're going to have enough for one day. Now, they're not to hoard it. They're just to have enough for the one day. If they try to save it, it's going to spoil on them. So only enough for one day. And they go outside the next morning, the Israelites, and they look, and sure enough, there's food. And they pick it up and they eat it, and they have enough for one day. And they look at it and they don't know what it is, and so they call it, what is it? In Hebrew, that's ma'ana. You might have heard that term, manna from heaven. And so it's coming down from heaven, and the people are going to be able to eat it. And this is what John has transposed. Now Jesus is this bread that comes down from heaven. So it's not as if John doesn't know the Old Testament tradition. Of course he does, but notice how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament tradition in a different way, say, than Matthew saw in Isaiah, where there's a direct, this happened to fulfill what this prophet said. John's gospel offers a slightly different way of looking at that. Rather than a one-to-one correspondent, John's gospel draws with a little bit of a different background to it. And this brings us to a rather gruesome, unless ye eat my flesh and drink his blood, you will not have life. You'll have no life in you. And this is obviously a precursor and in John's gospel leading up to the sacrament of Holy Communion. But to eat of Jesus' flesh and drink of his blood is a rather gruesome way of putting it. I want to talk to you about, the Good Shepherd. This passage pairs up well with Ezekiel 37. The shepherds that don't do the work, the shepherds that guard the Jerusalem, the religious authorities in Ezekiel's day have failed completely. Rather, you keep sheep to clothe. Sheep are good to put clothing, and they're good for food. And what have the Jewish authorities, as they call Israel the flock, they've taken advantage and killed the flock. And Jesus here is the good shepherd. So you see that if you read Ezekiel 37 and the narrative there that the prophet spins about the shepherds, the people, the religious authorities, and then here comes Jesus. He says he's the good shepherd. You see, you don't need a parable about the farmer, the shepherd who loses the one sheep. Jesus just comes and says, very truly, I tell you, I'm the gate for the sheep. So John 10. And then one more little piece. I want to talk to you about the vine and the branches. Here's Jesus talking about the way. I am the true vine. My Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I've spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. This teaching, look at this further down, as the Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. There's this reciprocal nature of love that seems to indicate the true nature of discipleship, and also the shared sap of the vine and the branch. The fact that the branches get pruned is a really interesting kind of thought. What does that mean in John's gospel? We're not sure. I mean, I can offer a couple suggestions, but not anything profound at this kind of an introductory level. Last thing I want to show you, the Pontius Pilate interaction with Jesus is interesting. We talked about that when we talked about the trial scene. But then as you look at this last chapter, after these things, Jesus showed himself. Jesus is raised from the dead here in John 21, and he showed himself in this way. He gathers with he gathered there, the disciples, Peter, all the named disciples, and they're going to fish, and they catch nothing. And Jesus said to them, children, have you any fish? And they say, no. And they say, drop your net. Jesus tells them to drop the net on the other side of the boat, as if fish are respect the side of the boat. Like, we've been on this side of the boat, just stay here. Well, they have such a catch. Peter recognizes that it's Jesus, and then he invites them, the risen Christ, the recognition that it's the Lord. Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Well, how did they know? I mean, there's no indication. Why is the question in here? That would seem to indicate that they should know. And Jesus finished breakfast, and 3 times he asked Simon, do you love me? 3 times to undo the three-part denial. And in each time, the word Jesus uses for love is that unconditional love, and Peter responds with the brotherly love. Well, this is all the time I have for John's Gospel. I hope you've found it interesting. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you with the next topic later on.